Thanks so much. Well, while we continue thinking about this, I'd like to introduce our next segment here. We are going to be able to see the Joel Peter, who was the Measure DD project manager for many of the projects, for the whole project of Lake Merritt improvement, but it had a special attachment and connection to the tidal marsh restoration at 12th Street. And so we're going to take a look at his experience and some of the things that he has to show us at that marsh.
My name is Joel Peter. I'm a retired program manager for the Measure DD bond program at the City of Oakland. Measure DD was a $198 million bond program that funded a variety of projects around the City of Oakland. Lots of park projects, open space preservation, restoring historic buildings all across the city, new recreation center, and a lot of work here at Lake Merritt, which is a saltwater estuary in the middle of the City of Oakland. Right now we're standing on the Lake Merritt Channel Tidal Marsh, and that's an area that was created from what was originally an underused park adjacent to the Lake Merritt Channel. This channel goes down and connects Lake Merritt to the estuary and San Francisco Bay. Most people don't realize that Lake Merritt is actually tidal. Water flows in and out twice a day with the tides, and it's a brackish water tidal slough. This time of year in the autumn, the rainfall is at its minimum. We've had a long dry spell, and freshwater input into the lake is at a minimum. So the water right here next to us is pretty much just as salty as San Francisco Bay. In the wintertime, you get a lot more fresh water, and that way you get this mixing of fresh and salt, and there are plants that are particularly adapted to that, and you'll find these here. So what was here before? Back in the old days, this was a quarter-mile wide tidal slough, narrowed down a little bit as it came into this area, but it was still all the way over to where the Oakland Museum is now. And Lake Merritt was mostly mudflat at low tide. There was the constant ebb and flow of the tides. There's a lot of wildlife, a lot of birds, and as humans entered into the scene, they began constricting the lake and the channel here, filling in more and more every year over 100 years, adding the city and pushing this into a very restricted waterway. That choked the flow that goes in and out of Lake Merritt, which had impacts on water quality, wildlife, and so on. As part of Measure DD, we wanted to restore some of the natural attributes of the lake a bit more like it used to be. So one of the plans is to open this channel wider, take out restrictive culverts that we had at 10th Street and at 12th Street that really choked the flow down, and in that way double the flow in and out of the lake. We now have a clear span bridge you can see there with a 100-foot wide channel, and the flow is much better than it used to be. Now, the other part that came up during the design process, one of our subconsultants, Philip Williams and Associates, came up with this idea of taking the parkland that was right here. It was about 10 feet higher than you see it now. It was an underused lawn area. There was a single basketball hoop, and only one person I ever saw ever used it. It was separated from the lake by a 12-lane expressway. So the idea was to reduce the expressway and open this up, make it more friendly, connect from Lake Merritt with pathways that would run down to San Francisco Bay and connect to the Bay Trail. But this area right here, Philip Williams came up with the idea that we had enough room, we could actually excavate down to sea level and remove that underused lawn and have a tidal marsh habitat here. And that was, I thought, just a brilliant idea. So we really went for that. We spent money from the City of Oakland's bond measure, and Coastal Conservancy added money to the mix. And we were able to excavate this down, very carefully grade at a very gentle slope. And it's designed so that as the tide comes up and down, this gets periodically inundated, and then the water recedes again. We planted then particular salt marsh plants. The pickleweed you see here is one of the primary plants. It's a succulent sort of a plant. It's actually edible. You'll see in some fine restaurants they usually call it sea asparagus or other names. The pickleweed, it's got a crunchy, salty flavor. And we found the birds like to graze on it, as well as it provides shelter for birds and some other creatures as well. So pickleweed can take inundation. It tends to grow in the lower part of the tidal marsh, so it can take more inundation than other plants. So we've spread this out. We originally had it planted in the upper area, and then we did experiments using student volunteers and other volunteers, putting these cages further and further down, closer to the edge, planting the pickleweed and seeing where it grows. And we found we can get it all the way down to the edge of the marsh, as you can see over in that area over there. Well, you brought the students out from Oakland High.
I did.
And they were instrumental in establishing these cages that we put here, doing lots of planting. They did all the monitoring. We've discovered through their records that we had an 80% survival rate once we put the cages up, which is really excellent for a marsh planting in a bare zone like this, particularly with all the Canada geese that we have at Lake Merritt that are always trying to eat what we do. The cages are in place to protect the young plants from grazing. Primarily Canada geese and American coots graze on the pickleweed and the other plants we were putting in. We found the best type is this one here. It's about 3 feet tall, wire fencing, 8 feet in diameter. It's small enough in diameter that a goose cannot fly into it. They need a long landing zone. So we scattered these around, and the pickleweed thrived. The pickleweed then generated seed and spread seed all around the area. So it sort of got a snowball rolling, and plants come up in between the cages. We then added more fencing between the cages. And after about 5 years, we were able to remove all the cages from the area up here because it had grown in so thick and well that it could withstand the grazing. So we're now, we've been adding cages further down, adding more fencing in between as the little seedlings come up. And we hope to be able to remove those cages eventually and have this entire marsh from the toe of the slope all the way to the channel edge thickly vegetated. The other plants that we've put in are in the higher reaches of the tidal zone. They get inundated for shorter periods of time. We have saltgrass, we have Frankinia, we have Jaumea. These are all plants that are adapted to salty soils and occasional inundation, and they sort of weave together into a net. You'll find that on the as you progress downward in elevation, you'll see each of the plants where they like to grow. Up higher, you'll even see salt bush, marsh gum plant, things like that can tolerate salt but really can't tolerate inundation. And further down, you get into the saltgrass and the Jaumea, and then finally we get down into the pickleweed at the lowest levels. So it's interesting to see how very small changes in water elevation affect plant life, each one adapted to its particular elevation and spot on the tidal marsh. One of the interesting things about this marsh is we also have some freshwater input. Up there you see a grove of willow trees. We have actually a spring coming out of the hillside up there that brings fresh water down and into the marsh. And that way we actually found We could plant freshwater plants, freshwater marsh plants. You'll find cattails up there and willows and other plants like that that just love to have their feet wet all the time. And then the blend, as the fresh water seeps down into the marsh, interacts with the incoming saltier water, and you get these different zones. Makes it particularly interesting as a marsh habitat. So the original idea was to have habitat for wildlife, habitat for tidal plants, also act as a filter for stormwater that's running out of the urban area. We've got a stormwater outfall right over here. Water comes off the parking lot that's up there, carrying, of course, all the little oils that drop out of automobiles and trash and things that are usually found in a parking lot. Originally, that just dumped directly into the channel. Now it actually comes out, goes through a little ditch, and winds its way and being filtered by the marsh itself before it gets into the water and contaminates the bay and the lake. So that was another reason that Philip Williams came up with this idea, acting both as habitat, as filter, and then finally as an educational resource. We have Laney College just downstream. Their biology classes and geography classes use the marsh as a teaching tool. And Oakland High School has had classes out here. So this is a piece of tidal marsh that you don't see anywhere else in Oakland. People can bring their students out here and learn about these habitats that were previously not available as a resource for educators. So it's actually got a pretty good multi-benefit use for this project. The sea level rise will affect Lake Merritt and the channel, as it does all of the areas that are subject to the tides. We have a tide control station at 7th Street, which is 3 blocks downstream. They have tide gates that they can close when excessively high tides come in. So for the present time, we will rely on that. Eventually, if it ever gets overtopped, that won't be able to protect the lake. But for the time being, the tide gates actually have an artificial means of protecting both the marsh and the lake. You'll find around the bay, as the tides go up over time, these marshlands will have to retreat inland. The areas that are now covered by pickleweed will be inundated far too much, too deeply, and too often for those plants to survive. So you'll probably see the pickleweed migrating upward, and ahead of it will be the jaumea and the saltgrass and so on, until it runs into a steep bank like this, which is typically what you find around San Francisco Bay. So the marshes will get compressed, and that's one of the effects of global climate change, will be the reduction of the marshland around San Francisco Bay.
Thank you, Joel.